My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter just as the rain started tapping against the window, and in that quiet gray light, I watched a number appear that made my hands go cold. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a notification, glowing calmly, telling me that years of careful saving had vanished while my coffee steamed untouched beside me. In that moment, the house felt too still, like it was holding its breath with me. If you're listening to this and you've ever trusted someone with more than you should have, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, because stories like this don't start the way we expect. I sat there staring at the screen, realizing the betrayal wasn't abstract or distant. It was personal. It had a face. It had history. And as the rain kept falling, I understood that this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was the first crack in something I thought was unbreakable. That was the moment everything began to unravel. I learned my retirement was gone on a quiet Tuesday morning, when my phone vibrated with a bank alert I didn't recognize. The number on the screen made my stomach drop, not because it was flashy, but because it represented decades of discipline disappearing in one silent click. That money wasn't extra. It was the result of packed lunches, skipped vacations, and staying in a modest Ohio suburb long after my friends upgraded their lives. I am 68 years old, a retired school administrator, and I built that account slowly because I believed security was earned, not gambled. As I scrolled through the transaction history, the truth surfaced with a clarity that felt almost surgical. The access trail led to my daughter. Not a hacker, not a stranger, my child. I didn't scream or panic. Shock passed quickly, replaced by a cold, steady calm. Confrontation would only warn her. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee going cold, and understood this was not an accident. It was a choice. And if she thought I wouldn't notice, she had underestimated more than my eyesight. What she didn't know yet was how that access existed, or how I would retrace it. I raised my daughter to believe the world was generous if you worked hard and stayed honest. For most of her life, I thought that lesson had landed. She was bright, charming, and always convinced that things would work out somehow. I was the opposite. I believed things only worked out because you planned for them. I saved steadily, quietly, year after year. I drove the same car until it wouldn't pass inspection. I packed lunches long after I could afford takeout. Security mattered to me because I grew up watching money vanish overnight when adults made careless choices. I promised myself I would never put my child in that position. She, on the other hand, lived in urgency. Bills felt like emergencies. Delays felt like disasters. She believed money was meant to keep life moving, not sitting still. I saw that difference as personality, not danger. That was my first mistake. When she asked for temporary access to my account months earlier, it didn't feel reckless. It felt practical. I trusted her because she was my daughter, and because trust had always been the default setting in our relationship. Mothers don't audit their children. We believe first and question later. There were small things I ignored. Requests that came with pressure. Explanations that felt rehearsed. My own quiet discomfort that I brushed aside because suspicion felt colder than love. Trust doesn't collapse all at once. It thins. It stretches. It erodes while you're busy convincing yourself everything is fine. Looking back, I didn't miss the warning signs because I was naive. I missed them because I loved her, and love made urgency feel reasonable. And when the first real emergency arrived, it sounded exactly like the kind of call a mother never ignores. The call came early, before I had fully settled into the day, carrying that familiar edge of panic that makes a parent stop thinking. I remember standing in my kitchen, listening to the rush of urgency spill out all at once. There was a housing problem, a sudden repair issue, a looming deadline, Everything felt immediate, layered, and impossible to delay. My mind tried to slow it down. I remember thinking that real emergencies usually arrive one at a time. But motherhood has a way of silencing logic. When your child sounds frightened, your instincts move faster than your questions. I told myself this was temporary. Just help her get through the moment. Just bridge the gap. She needed quick access. Not forever, just long enough to stabilize things. That was how it formed in my head, a practical solution to an emotional problem. I hesitated, felt that quiet tug in my chest, then overruled it. Love has a way of disguising risk as responsibility. The first withdrawal didn't alarm me. It matched the story I had been given. I explained it away as deposits, repairs, necessary expenses. The second one felt less comfortable, but still plausible. Moving is expensive. Crises ripple. I reminded myself that this was why I had saved in the first place. But the numbers didn't pause. They kept coming. Each alert arrived closer together, each amount larger than the last. I began to feel that familiar tightness behind my ribs, the one that shows up when something doesn't align but you can't yet name why. I wanted to call, to demand clarity, to pull everything back. Instead, I waited. I told myself I needed more information before reacting. That confronting too early would only scatter whatever truth was still visible. By the time the withdrawal started outpacing the explanation, I understood one thing clearly. This wasn't unfolding slowly anymore. It was accelerating. And whatever was happening, it was no longer just an emergency. When my calls started going unanswered, the panic I expected never arrived. Instead, something quieter took its place. A tightening awareness that told me to stop chasing reassurance and start paying attention. I drove past the apartment she had described, the place that was supposedly unraveling her life. The building stood exactly as it always had. No emergency vehicles, no signs of damage, just normal traffic and closed blinds. I sat in my car longer than necessary, letting that image settle, because once you see something that doesn't match the story, you can't unsee it. Back home. I opened my phone and scrolled without intention. That was when I saw it. Smiling photos, casual captions, moments that looked relaxed, expensive, and completely unbothered. There was no trace of urgency, no evidence of the chaos I had been funding, just ease, celebration, distance. Anger rose, sharp and immediate, but I didn't act on it. I felt something steadier pushing it down. Clarity. The realization that this wasn't confusion or poor planning. It was deliberate. The lies were layered, rehearsed, and unfolding exactly as designed. I noticed how quickly my emotions wanted me to explode, to demand answers, to reclaim control by force. Instead, I chose stillness. Silence gave me room to think. It allowed patterns to surface without interference. Each new transaction, each new post, added definition to the picture forming in my mind. I stopped asking questions that would only trigger better lies. I stopped signaling concern. I watched. That was the moment I understood something important. Silence wasn't surrender. It was information gathering. And the more I held back, the clearer the truth became. By the time I set my phone down, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was documenting. Whatever came next would not be driven by emotion. It would be driven by evidence. The shift didn't come with a dramatic moment. It arrived quietly, after I had seen enough to stop doubting myself. I remember sitting alone, reviewing what I had gathered, and realizing I was done chasing explanations that would never be honest. I made a clear decision. I would not beg for answers. I would not argue. I would not react in ways that gave away what I knew or what I was planning. Emotion had gotten me into this position. Discipline would get me out. I started taking practical steps. I secured what accounts I could. I documented dates, amounts, patterns. I saved screenshots and transaction records, not with fury, but with focus. Each action grounded me. Each small task returned a piece of control I thought I had lost. That was when I understood the difference between rage and power. Rage demands immediate relief. Power waits. Rage exposes itself. Power stays quiet and observant. For the first time since the withdrawals began, I felt steady. Not calm in the sense of forgiveness, but calm in the sense of clarity. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was protecting myself. That distinction mattered. I also realized something else. I had been underestimated, seen as emotional, predictable, easy to dismiss once distracted by fear. That miscalculation worked in my favor, because once someone believes you are broken, they stop hiding. And the more I looked, the more it became clear this situation wasn't just about one bad decision. It was part of something larger, something patterned, and something that was finally starting to unravel. Once I started looking beyond my own account, the story widened in ways I hadn't expected. I stopped asking why and began asking how the access was timed, how the urgency was layered, how the withdrawals followed a rhythm that felt practiced rather than panicked. I reached out for outside help, not because I wanted validation, but because I needed objectivity, someone who could look at the facts without the emotional fog of motherhood. As I gathered records and timelines, patterns emerged that mirrored my experience too closely to dismiss. The same sequence of urgency, the same explanations, the same escalation once access was granted. That was when denial finally collapsed. This wasn't a single lapse in judgment. It was a repeatable method, a structure designed to bypass caution and exploit trust. Seeing it laid out stripped away any comfort I had been clinging to. The hardest realization wasn't the scale of the loss. It was understanding that my daughter hadn't stumbled into this. She had participated, not confused, not coerced, willing. That truth settled heavily, changing grief into something colder and more permanent. What began as a private betrayal started to resemble something broader. Others had experienced similar financial drains, similar stories that sounded reasonable until they were placed side by side. The more I learned, the clearer it became that this was not simply a family matter gone wrong. As the evidence grew, so did the implications. Certain thresholds matter. Certain patterns attract attention beyond banks and lawyers. I became aware that this situation carried weight it could not shed quietly. I felt a strange mix of devastation and resolve. Devastation for the child I thought I knew. Resolve because this was no longer just about my retirement or my trust. It was about accountability. By the time I finished assembling everything, one fact stood out unmistakably. Whatever happened next would not stay behind closed doors. The thread I had pulled had unraveled something much larger, and there was no way to tuck it back into silence. Once the information left my hands, events moved without my participation. That was intentional. I didn't call, I didn't warn, I didn't step in to soften anything. I had already done my part by telling the truth and letting it stand on its own. What followed unfolded publicly and quickly. There were records reviewed, accounts frozen, and questions asked by people whose job was not to preserve feelings. I watched from a distance, not out of cruelty, but because stepping closer would have turned accountability into interference. This was no longer a private family issue. It was a matter of consequences, meeting actions. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel relief. What I felt was gravity, the kind that settles in when you realize a line has been crossed and cannot be uncrossed. Seeing my daughter face public scrutiny was not satisfying. It was sobering. But I did not rush in to rescue her from a situation she had built deliberately. There is a difference between mercy and avoidance. I had practiced avoidance for too long. This time, I chose clarity. Accountability is not revenge. It is the natural outcome of choices when they are allowed to reach their conclusion. I noticed how quiet everything became once the initial shock passed. No arguments, no dramatic scenes, just a steady forward motion that didn't require my approval or my resistance. The process didn't ask how I felt. It didn't bend for history or biology. That was when I understood something important. Justice is not loud. It doesn't perform. It simply arrives, does its work, and leaves behind a silence that forces everyone involved to sit with what remains. And when that silence finally settled, I realized peace had not arrived with it, only space. After everything went quiet, the silence felt heavier than the chaos that came before it. The phone stopped ringing. The updates stopped coming. Life returned to a shape that looked normal from the outside, but nothing inside me felt settled yet. I recovered some of the money, not all of it, enough to stay afloat, enough to adjust instead of collapse. I revised plans I had held for years. Travel became smaller. Comfort became simpler. I learned how quickly numbers turn into boundaries and how acceptance sometimes looks like recalculation rather than anger. The deeper loss wasn't financial. It was realizing that the version of my daughter I had trusted no longer existed. Not temporarily, permanently. Grieving someone who is still alive is a quiet kind of mourning. There is no ceremony for it, just an ongoing recognition that the relationship you knew is gone, even if the person remains. I let myself feel that grief without trying to dress it up as forgiveness or rage. Some days were easier, some were hollow. I learned to sit with that emptiness instead of rushing to fill it with meaning too soon. Then messages started arriving, strangers reaching out, sharing stories that sounded painfully familiar. Parents, grandparents, siblings, people who had been taken advantage of by someone they loved and didn't know how to name it. Reading those messages shifted something in me. What I thought was a private failure wasn't private at all. It was part of a pattern that thrives on silence and shame. And in that realization, the quiet began to change. It stopped feeling like an ending and started feeling like a pause. A space where something honest, though not yet redemptive, might eventually take shape. The first sign of change didn't come with apologies or explanations. It came with responsibility. Months after the silence settled, I noticed quiet actions that didn't ask for forgiveness or sympathy. Bills paid without reminders. Paperwork completed without shortcuts. Obligations met without complaint. Nothing dramatic. Just consistency. My instinct wanted to soften. Years of motherhood don't disappear because trust is broken, but I didn't let instinct lead. I watched instead. I reminded myself that real change doesn't announce itself, it repeats itself. There were no grand gestures, no emotional speeches meant to pull me back in. What I saw were sustained efforts that didn't require my approval to continue. That mattered. Anyone can behave well when they are being watched. Far fewer do it when they think no one is paying attention. I kept my boundaries firm. Forgiveness did not mean access. Compassion did not mean control. I made it clear to myself that trust and love are not the same thing. I could care without risking myself again. That distinction became my anchor. There were moments of tension I didn't share with anyone. Moments when memory argued with evidence, when I missed who I thought she was and had to accept who she had proven herself to be. Letting go of hope for an easy repair was harder than holding on to anger. What surprised me was how restraint felt empowering. By refusing to rush reconciliation, I protected both of us. I wasn't enabling harm, and I wasn't pretending it hadn't happened. I was allowing space for accountability to exist without being rewarded prematurely. Redemption, I learned, is not something a parent grants. It's something a person earns through time, effort, and humility. Whether it would fully arrive, I didn't know yet, but I did know this. If any relationship was rebuilt, it would not resemble the one we lost. It would be slower, quieter, and built on terms shaped by reality rather than hope. What we rebuilt didn't look like the family we used to be. It moved slower, quieter. There were no sudden reunions or emotional resets, just careful proximity, chosen rather than assumed. We started with neutral ground, short conversations, practical check-ins, time spent together that had a clear beginning and end. At first, it felt unfamiliar, almost formal, like learning how to speak a shared language again after years apart. But it was honest, and honesty mattered more than comfort. Before everything happened, our relationship ran on access, unlimited trust, emotional shortcuts. I didn't realize how fragile that structure was until it collapsed. What replaced it was sturdier. Boundaries were clear. Expectations were spoken. Accountability wasn't implied. It was required. There were moments of warmth that surprised me. Small things, shared routines, a laugh that wasn't forced. Those moments didn't erase the past, but they didn't compete with it either. They existed alongside it, grounded in reality rather than nostalgia. I learned that trust doesn't have to be complete to be meaningful. Connection doesn't require forgetting. Love can exist without blind faith. That understanding changed how I defined family. Family, I realized, isn't about proximity or history alone. It's about behavior, about showing up consistently, about respecting limits instead of pushing past them. The relationship we were building now demanded more effort, but it also carried more integrity. There was a strange comfort in that, stability without illusion, care without self-betrayal. I wasn't trying to recreate what we lost. I was allowing something different to take shape. And in doing that, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle in. Not because everything was fixed, but because I finally understood what mattered, what endured, and what lessons this experience had carved into me. That understanding stayed with me, guiding how I saw not just my family, but myself, and the meaning I would carry forward from all of it. When I look back on everything now, I don't see the betrayal as the defining moment of my life. I see the clarity that followed it. Losing money hurt. Losing trust hurt more. But learning where my boundaries truly were changed everything. I learned that love without limits isn't kindness. It's vulnerability without protection. Accountability isn't cruelty. It's respect for yourself and for the truth. And peace doesn't come from pretending something didn't happen. It comes from facing it, setting boundaries, and choosing how you move forward. Today, I feel steady. Not because everything turned out perfectly, but because I stopped abandoning myself to keep someone else comfortable. I learned that strength can be quiet, patient, and deeply grounded. I don't live in fear anymore, and I don't live in denial either. If you're listening to this and walking through something similar, I want you to know you're not weak for loving deeply, and you're not heartless for protecting yourself. Both can exist at the same time. You are allowed to choose dignity. You are allowed to choose peace. Thank you for sitting with my story and giving it your time. If this resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your experience. Have you ever had to choose boundaries over comfort with someone you loved? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one, and your voice matters.